Welcome back, everybody, in the afternoon of the International Conference, a partnership between equals, the EU-Africa relationship in an increasingly complex world. We had a wonderful morning with a lot of interesting speakers and contributions, and obviously we will continue the afternoon like we have started with more interesting conversations and topics. As mentioned in the opening of the conference by Ana Patricia Fonseca, who is the president of the Portuguese NGDO platform, the platform launches today the report European Union and Africa towards a partnership between equals. This publication is available both in Portuguese in the platform website and along with a brief in Portuguese and English. And the full English version of the report will be available in the upcoming days. So we are all looking forward to that. You can access the report and the brief in Portuguese and English in the link that is now being shared in the chat. Before I give the word to Luisa, who will chair the next part of this conference, I would like to ask you just to write one word in the chat about this morning. If you were here, what is your one-word reflection of the morning? I'm curious to see what comes out. You can just click on the chat button in the bottom and just write a word. And then after that, we will go straight to Luisa, who will facilitate a panel on equality-driven partnership that leaves no one behind. And I see the first things popping up: inspiring, challenging. We had some technical difficulties, but it's also a challenging topic, of course. Honesty. I also heard some quite honest responses. What else? We are 66 people here in the meeting, so maybe there are some more people who are writing. Feel free to keep on writing. In the meantime, I will introduce briefly Luisa. Luisa is the International Cooperation Officer at Caritas Europe, which is a network of 49 European member organizations, including 20 that work on international cooperation. And she has been working there for over 2 years, focusing on EU-Africa relations, EU development aid's roles in reducing inequalities, empowerment of local actors, and the migration development nexus. And she's also part of the EU-Africa leading group in Concord, Europe. Prior to moving to Brussels, she was working in Algeria, in Brazil, which is also her hometown. She has been in Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, like all over the world. And she holds an MA in human rights and humanitarian action as well. So definitely the right person to host this next panel. Luisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sven. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel on an equality-driven partnership that leaves no one behind. We'll see in a minute what our panelists think about this theme. What I hope we will get the chance to discuss is how this renewed partnership between Africa and the EU can help redress power imbalances, how it can help reduce socioeconomic and political inequalities, how it can empower marginalized groups. But perhaps the key underlining question to our discussions right now is something that actually came up this morning, which is who will this partnership benefit? Who will gain from this new framework? And let's see what our panelists have to say about that. We have a great selection of speakers. I'm really flattered to be here facilitating the discussions amongst you today. And we will begin with a 3-minute speech by each of them. And I'll introduce each of them as I give the floor to you. And then after that, we will have time for questions and answers also from the audience. So please do get familiarized with the system here in Zoom and begin to submit your questions through the Q&A box as we go through. So I would like to start with Cristina Muniz. Cristina is the Vice President at Camões, the Portuguese Development Agency, since August 2020. Previously, Cristina served as Embassy Attaché at the Secretary of State, and then she joined the permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. And more recently, she served at the permanent representation of Portugal to the European Union in Brussels. Thank you, Christine, for joining us. And could you please launch our panel with your 3-minute contribution to this theme of an equality-driven partnership that leaves no one behind? It's a very brief kickoff, but I do have a note here to help you keep track of time. So please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luísa. I see that you are going to be very strict with me. Eu vou fazer a minha intervenção em português também porque neste painel...
I will be speaking in English. Also because in this panel we have a guest speaker who will certainly speak in English. I hope this will not make understanding and communication hard for you. And the interpreter reminds there is simultaneous interpretation of all speakers. I would like to thank the organization for the invitation that was addressed to me, especially on such a topical theme. Relations with Africa are certainly a priority for Portuguese foreign affairs that has a long history of cultural, economic, political relations with the African continent. Therefore, relationships between Africa and the European Union is once again paramount and at the top stands at the top of the agenda of the Portuguese presidency of the European Union Council. Relations with Africa, both bilateral and in the European context, and in those relations we have on an ongoing basis supported a partnership based on equality without leaving anyone behind, which has also actually guided Portugal's position since at least 2007, when we first hosted the first EU-Africa summit in Lisbon, when also the framework, the partnership framework document was signed. In other words, the EU-Africa joint strategy. Having said this, allow me to please review the Portuguese presidency of the EU in the area of development cooperation, where Camões Institute plays a leading role, and where we are also responsible for developing and closing legislative files with the African continent. The neighborhood instrument, with an endowment of approximately 1 billion euros for the period of 2021 and 2027, which was adopted in March. Africa is at the top of the priorities with a financial envelope of approximately 30 million euros for sub-Saharan Africa. And in reality, we see funding increase against the cycle that we see in other geographies, actually. Furthermore, allow me to also highlight the post-Cotonou agreement conclusions. It is a broad and ambitious agreement based on a essentially political and strategic partnership with ACP countries as a whole, and in particular with the 3 regions. Also, we are preparing the conclusions of the Council in view of prioritizing the goals of Africa and the European Union. I highlight 2 conclusions negotiated by Portugal and that are currently being negotiated. Conclusions on human development, Council conclusions, and this is the first time that we come to conclusions, arrive at conclusions in this area, and also Council conclusions on the development agreement with countries in transition. More than 50% of African partners are middle and high income countries. I would like to highlight that.
Mas que respondem às necessidades de primeira linha.
And the speaker is reading part of the text of the conclusions. Many of these results differentiate EU with partner countries. In the dimension of investment, I would also like to highlight the green talks during our presidency held in several African and European capitals, as well as the high-level African Forum on green investment, from which two key results were drawn, including demonstrating that sustainable and green business is viable. In the humanitarian area, we elected among our priorities the enhancement of the humanitarian development and peace nexus, particularly in the African context, particularly since this is a facilitating approach to integrated solutions. And we also focused on human development with particular importance given to education, particularly in the context of conflict. Also in the humanitarian context, we adopted recently Council conclusions on EU humanitarian action, new challenges, the same principles, which we consider to be quite relevant for our intervention. Finally, I would also like to mention the Council decision adopted this week in view of opening up negotiations on an agreement for facilitating investment with Angola for mutually beneficial actions, business promoting actions in the Angolan economy. EU-African relations were at the core of the Portuguese presidency, namely in the results envisaged. At the end of the presidency, obviously, we need to ensure that the priorities assumed are implemented. Of course, Portugal will be paying very close attention to this, in particular in the next EU partner country cycle, considering the important the upcoming EU-Africa, EU-AU summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. Sorry for the time pressure, but we'll definitely have more time during the debate to get into detail because you mentioned a lot of relevant frameworks, and of course it's important that coherence is ensured between them, so the objective of reducing inequalities and really promoting human development is achieved. But thanks for starting us off. So now I'd like to turn to Ernestina. Ernestina, is she here? I don't see her with the camera. Yes? Yes, great. Yeah. So before I give the floor to you, let me introduce you to our audience. Ernestina Menezes is the Executive Director of the National Institute for the Promotion of Gender Equality in São Tomé and Príncipe since 2010. She is a member of the Pan-African Network of Women, the gender focal point for the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, the gender focal point of the African Union, and a member of the Secretariat of the African Economic Commission representing her country. So she definitely has a lot of hats that are very much relevant to the topic we're discussing today. In the past, she was also the National Director of Public Administration at the Ministry of Justice of São Tomé and Príncipe. Ernestina, thanks for joining us. Could you also please offer your first thoughts for today's discussions in 3 minutes, if possible? Thank you. Sorry, you have to unmute yourself first. Yes, thank you.
Agora sim. Boa tarde a todos. Antes de
Good
mais,
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to first begin by thanking the organization for inviting me to take part in this panel, and I will begin immediately. As Luisa highlighted, I have actively participating in many African forums, and as a result of that, I have taken good note of many of the topics discussed at the African Union. EU and AU cooperation being one of them. As you know, Europe is one of the biggest financiers of the African Union. And in this context, we have several programs. We're talking about our 2063 program and also other regional programs, most of which are funded by the European Union. So, in the African Union, we intensively discuss the different matters to ensure that EU and AU cooperation and cooperation with African countries are fruitful on both sides of the table, because we are very much committed to integration, cooperation for development, and integration. And if so, we should all benefit from it. So in the context of cooperation, we are very much committed to training. We are working a lot on training because we believe that our projects and our plans must have an impact. And what type of impact can EU-Africa cooperation have for both African citizens and European citizens? So we discuss these impacts. We also focus a lot on objectiveness, transparency, effectiveness of our projects. And in order to ensure all of this, within the African Union and in the African member countries, there are several strategies that are set up, and through partnerships with both governments and NGOs. In our African strategy for gender equality, in our 2020 program, you know that in 2020, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. And in 2019, we also commemorated the 25th anniversary of the CAPD. And we analyzed all of these documents to be able to assess what we have achieved so far. And we came to the conclusion that civil society, organized civil society, and NGOs play a very important part, because we need to involve much more. Civil society has been involved, but we need to involve them much more in the implementation, but above all in the monitoring of the programs that are implemented under these two pillars that I mentioned. So, according to the recommendations of the CAPD and other agreements, one of the recommendations concern civil society and enhanced involvement of civil society. In view of enhanced supervision, not only of implementers, but also of the financiers and of the financing instruments. So we discussed how we could improve surveillance, monitoring, tracking and tracing to ensure transparency of those instruments of funders. We also need to assess the impacts, because millions and millions of euros and dollars have been spent, but the impacts, the effects on the ground do not actually correspond to such large amounts of financing. So we realize that there is a lot of weakness in human resources, so we should also invest much more in human resources, but above all, in the exchange of experiences. We realize that the European Union is a developed region, and this is where we get our experts from. We need them to help our nationals to find the best solutions, the best methodologies for achieving more and better results. So we have listed as fundamental elements of cooperation, objectiveness, transparency, and the impacts that should be monitored. The impacts of programs and development instruments should be monitored. Thank you very much for the 3 minutes that were allocated to me, and I'm open for the discussion.
That was already very insightful. I'm sure we can go back to some of the very important points that you mentioned. And last, but definitely not least, I would like to welcome also Karin. Thanks for joining us. Karin is the Executive Director of ADEPT, the Africa-Europe Diaspora Development Platform. Before joining ADEPT in early 2020, Karin worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for Development Cooperation and also at the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs. She also holds a PhD in African Contemporary History. Karin, what would you like to share with us in this first few minutes?
Thank you very much. I will try to stick to the 3 minutes. It will be a challenge, but I will try. I will start by saying that it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to thank the Portuguese Platform of Development NGOs for this invitation to such an important event. I think that this conference is particularly noteworthy. First of all, for its relevance, of course, but also for its timeliness, as we are increasingly talking about the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, and that we know that the EU-AU partnership will play a critical role in it. Sorry. So in my intervention, I would like to talk about 3 issues. First of all, the COVID-19, secondly, migration, but also the importance of inclusiveness when it comes to the implementation of the partnership. So we all know that the pandemic has proved that in this very globalized world, no one is safe until everybody is safe, which typically underscores the idea of solidarity. And that, for example, goes against the idea of COVID-19 vaccines, nationalism, and all that is fully in line with SDGs and with the leave no one behind principle. When it comes to migration, more specifically, during COVID-19, it has been shown that migrants and people of migrant background play a very important part in residence countries, so namely here in Europe, but also in origin countries, as illustrated by the fact that many were and are still COVID-19 frontliners. They also play a very important role because of remittances, which has remained a lifeline for communities in Africa, even more than in normal times. They also contributed to the response to the COVID-19 in many ways. For example, some of them raised funds to finance personal protective equipment for medical staff in Africa. Others have set up face mask production lines. So it's just to show the importance of migration. We know that the European Commission has sent a very positive signal with a new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, given that this document makes provision for more developed legal migration pathways that will facilitate labor migration. But we have to make sure that this proposal will be a triple win. So a win for the migrants, a win for destination countries, but also a win for origin countries. And we have to make sure that it will not cripple the development of Africa, because we know that it may lead to brain drain. So while these measures are really welcome, we have to really ensure that they won't have an adverse effect on developing countries or on African countries more specifically. So I would like to talk also about the importance of inclusive action, because I think that this is directly linked to what I have said, because I think that we have come to the realization that collective and inclusive action is the only way to go to overcome global challenges. And we think that that type of actions should become the norm, hence the need to form fully inclusive multi-stakeholder partnerships, including diaspora organizations, and of course, European and African civil society organizations, when it comes to the implementation of the AU-EU partnership. And so I think that all these issues that I have raised should be reflected in the partnership between both sides, and notably influence the way migration is tackled. This should, of course, lead to more solidarity, which is linked to the interdependence that I mentioned earlier. And this should also lead to putting human development at the center of the partnership when it comes to health in particular. And we have seen the fragility of health system in Africa. So it's health that I would like to put the focus on, but also social protection, because we have seen that during the pandemic, African population were really underserved when it comes to social protection. So I will stop here.
Thanks, Karine. Thank you to the three of you for kicking off our discussions. Now we have some 15 minutes or so to dive a little bit deeper. I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A, so I'd like to invite the audience to reflect if there are any questions that you have to any of them. But we also had prepared some questions taking into consideration your expertise. So I'd like to start with one of them, which is for Cristina. Cristina, the Portuguese presidency, as you mentioned, has prioritized human development. However, in the context of the negotiations on the new EU-Africa partnership, when the Commission made its first proposal at the beginning of last year, our perception is that it actually failed to highlight the issue of inequalities or to place as a very high priority the reduction of inequalities or even human development in some of the aspects that, for example, Karine mentioned now, such as social protection systems. We know that throughout the negotiations, this has been changing also to reflect the needs that are very clear with the pandemic, but this was not there from the beginning. In addition to that, another concern is regarding the process, which Karina also mentioned now when she was referring to the inclusiveness of the multilateral partnerships. And it also something that came up a lot this morning. And how can we make sure that all the different actors are part of the table? And I remember one of the speakers saying that how can we promote a paradigm shift, and how can we really make sure that this new framework is transformative, so it really works for the furthest behind if they are not really necessarily at the discussion table. So taking all that into consideration, could you tell us what would you like to see in this last month or so of the Portuguese presidency? What do you think you would like to see as the mark that the presidency will leave in this regard? I'll give you a few minutes and then the other panelists can also comment on that, or we can take other questions. Please go ahead.
Muito obrigada, Luísa, pelas questões. Nós temos ainda mês pela frente.
Thank you very much for your questions. We still have a month ahead of us, and at least in the area of development, we can at least say that we have already done a lot, contributed a lot, particularly to the discussions on this panel. And we will continue on that path. I mentioned earlier that we had set as a priority the adoption of the Council's conclusions on human development. And indeed, if we focus on that priority, we thought that it would make more sense than ever to bring this onto the EU agenda, not because it's not there. Human development has always been one of development cooperation's priority areas for the European Union. However, we felt that more than ever in the current context, particularly resulting from the pandemic and all of the challenges stemming from the crisis, in particular for development countries, we thought that it was very important to focus on this aspect. And even more so because we felt that EU priorities were too concentrated on aspects which are equally important and will also be important for our cooperation partners, but that do not necessarily resolve human development issues, such as the priority on the Green Deal, digital transition, because as I was saying, it's very important for all of us, but this cannot be the top priority in our relations with Africa. So human development was put on the agenda. We negotiated the Council conclusions, which haven't yet been published, which haven't yet been formally adopted. We already have an agreement on the wording, on the text, and it will be in the coming month of June adopted politically. So I urge you to then read them very closely. In these Council conclusions, we focused quite particularly on health. It was elected as one of our top priorities, and it makes a sense when we are talking about development cooperation and all of the problems that our societies are faced with. It is very important. So health is also a priority of the Portuguese priority, and another priority which is very dear to Portuguese cooperation is education. Education was also mentioned by Ernestina. The importance of human resource training is still a priority in the African context. So these were the main areas, but of course food security as well, economic cooperation as well, in addition to other needs like water and sanitation. And we can never forget the implementation of human rights, gender equality, among so many other topics. So in relation to development, this is essentially what I wanted to highlight. So through the adoption of the Council conclusions, I do hope that the Portuguese presidency may shine the light on what will be included in the EU, the next EU programming period. I hope that the next programming period will focus a lot on human development. At least this is one of the aspirations of the Portuguese presidency. Inclusiveness in these processes, in these dialogues. In relation to that, I think that Portugal is always in a quite comfortable position because during the presidency, we did something that we have always done, which is to support an inclusion agenda. We have always done so in our relationships with Africa directly, in the context of EU-African relations. We have always highlighted this multi-stakeholder partnership. This has always been a priority of our political stance. And obviously during the Portuguese presidency, we did not forget this. And we tried to reflect it in the way we conducted works in the EU Council. We brought, for that reason, to our discussions, to our platforms, civil society, stakeholders, players. Concord took part in our work in CODER when we were discussing human development. The high-level EU Africa Forum on Green Investment also had the participation of stakeholders, a variety of stakeholders whom we thought would provide invaluable input to discussions, in addition to government representatives, representatives of regional and sub-regional organizations, and civil society, academia, the private sector, with whom increasingly it is important to work in partnership with. So we held quite participated discussions, and we drew conclusions that resulted from each of these stakeholders' inputs.
Turn to Ernestina to add comments in relation to what Christina has said. And also, if you can comment a bit on which recommendations you would have moving forward for the partnership between EU and Africa, also taking into consideration your perspective, working at the national agency, of how this cooperation has happened so far and how it has helped promote human development or reduce gender inequalities. So based on this experience, what do you think that needs to be changed in this new framework? And I would like to combine this question with something that came up in the chat. I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. It's a question related to the partnership between civil society and the African Union. Also, which structures, for example, or in which sectors should this partnership be focused on? So maybe you can comment on the looking forward on these two aspects. Thank you.
Ok, mais uma vez, obrigada, Luísa.
Thank you, Luísa, once again. As the other speakers have highlighted, the COVID pandemic hit everyone quite unexpectedly. And in face of this crisis, we need to evoke cooperation at the level of technical empowerment. We need to also focus on key groups, on special groups, because we often do not pay a lot of attention to vulnerable groups. And I'm not only talking about gender inequality, men and women inequality. There are other vulnerable groups because COVID brought to the light of day other vulnerable groups like sex professionals, people with disabilities. And in the pandemic, these groups of people suffered severely. And we need to be solidary. But we need to extend our solidarity to also these vulnerable groups who have suffered severely from the crisis. Another area that we need to pay close attention to is technology. The pandemic as well showed us that technology is the cornerstone of or through which we can work, collaborate, cooperate. And we are well aware that African countries and African human resources have very weak access to technology and to technological skills, IT skills. So these are main areas of concern. Consequently, and the reports show this, we need to develop technology more, in particularly technology used by women. Women are even more segregated in periods like these because they do not have the technological skills, and also other vulnerable groups. It is necessary to empower women and girls, which are also a problem. And in particular in São Tomé, I believe that in all parts of Africa, but in São Tomé, sexual abuse and domestic violence increased significantly during the crisis. These are all vulnerable groups to which we should pay very close attention under the scope of North-South cooperation, because many of these groups live in very dire conditions. So it is very important that right now we focus a lot on social responsibility in these social areas so that we can involve everyone in the discussions, thus allowing society or helping society to recover from the effects of the COVID. We clearly retroceded significantly as a result of COVID.
Thanks so much. And I would like to give the floor very briefly to Karina once again before we can quickly wrap up. Sorry that we're running a few minutes, but I want to make sure that she gets a chance to speak again. I would like to seize this opportunity that you're here and your expertise on migration and to ask you a question related to talent partnerships and the fact that this proposal that is on the table now in the context of the new framework of the EU Africa partnership is mainly focused on attracting high-skilled workers to Europe. So what's your opinion on this approach, and do you think that it could have, what do you think would be the impact regarding inequalities in the long term? And also, if you want to add any conclusions related to what the other panelists said, you're welcome to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very quickly, when it comes to human development, I think that one of the lessons learned from the pandemic is that human development in Africa cannot be overlooked. We know that the crisis was at the same time a health crisis, but also an economic crisis with soaring unemployment, which means that in the post-COVID-19, we will have to put the emphasis on job creation, but also employability, notably of young people, which also means the focus on education and upskilling. So this is clearly some issue that cannot be sidelined in the partnership. When it comes to inclusiveness, as I said, during the pandemic, the civil society, diaspora organizations have played crucial parts. That's the reason why I think that in the partnership, they cannot be seen as peripheral actors, and we have to find a way to ensure a dialogue between all parties in a very systematic and structured way in the run-up to the summit, but also when it comes to the implementation of the partnership. We know that, for example, when it comes to diaspora organizations or individuals, they have an added value. They are well placed to provide knowledge or skills transfer that can be extremely useful for Africa, especially African youth. As regards talent partnerships, I think that a balance has to be found, a sort of equilibrium, and that's the reason why I talked about a triple win. So for the migrant, for the destination countries, but also for origin countries, and we have to find a way to mitigate the potential negative impacts. We have to do so by reinforcing circular migration to make sure that the knowledge and skills that will be developed by migrant workers in Europe will also benefit African countries, so through circular migration. Another way to mitigate the potential impact of these measures is to, as I said, really reinforce education programs so that Africa will have also a workforce that is appropriately skilled.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Karine, and thanks for being brief. Unfortunately, now we reached the end of this panel, but I would like to thank you all for your presence. I think you made very valuable contributions that help us understand a bit better the different key issues and principles that were already touched upon this morning. I think this was enriching to think about how we can apply those ideas also in these different thematic areas of your experience. And they are different, but they fit nicely together because inequalities is something multi-dimensional, of course. So thanks for your contributions. And I hope that we can continue to digest them and take them into account in the next sessions and also in the future opportunities for discussions like this in the lead up to the summit. So thank you once more, and thanks for the audience as well and the interpretation that has been ongoing. And now I'll hand over back to Isfan.
Thank you, Louisa, for navigating this conversation. And obviously also thank you to all the speakers for your contribution. It's also for me a very interesting learning experience already today. No time to waste because we are moving already to the next panel, which is titled A Fair, Inclusive and Sustainable Economic Partnership. And it will be moderated by Jean Saldenya, who's the Eurodet director. Jean, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sven, and a warm welcome. And again, good afternoon, good day to all our participants, wherever you may be. COVID-19 has unleashed a pandemic of unimaginable proportions, and we've heard of that, I'm sure, throughout the day, and especially I think that Karine and Ernestina mentioned it, that it has been pushing back an estimated 150 million people into extreme poverty and 137 million to the brink of starvation, representing an increase of over 80% in acute hunger since before the pandemic began. Especially women will be inevitably pushed into extreme poverty as compared to men. As UN Women put it, more women, for countless women in economies of every size, along with losing income, the unpaid care and domestic work burden has exploded. More importantly, gender-based violence is becoming, as the UN Secretary General called it, a pandemic of its own. A major lesson from this pandemic is that human development is and will remain a priority to reduce inequality, strengthening populations' resilience to shocks, whether from pandemics to climate disasters, as well as slow onset events like desertification and sea level rise. The questions we will debate this afternoon during this session is what should the priorities and the nature of a fair, inclusive and sustainable economic partnership between EU and Africa look like to build forward better. And I am joined this afternoon by two very distinguished speakers, and it's a pleasure for me to facilitate this panel together with them. We have Domenico Rosa. Domenico Rosa is the head of the Strategic Partnerships with Africa and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean and Pacific States Union at the Directorate General for International Partnerships, INPA, of the European Commission. He also leads the DevCo post-Cotonou task force, which steered the negotiations leading to the initialing of the new agreement between the EU and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, Pacific States in April 2021. Domenico previously served in various cabinets of the European Commission, including the cabinet of Commissioner Piebalgs and the cabinet of Commissioner Michel de Gucht, Louis Michel and de Gucht, obviously. He has a master's degree in political economy from the Bocconi University in Milan and international politics from the University of the ULB in Brussels, and as well a degree in psychology at the University of Padua. A warm welcome to you, Domenico. And over to Paul Okumu, who is the head of Secretariat of the African Platform, an organization working on the social contract and state-society relations. Previously, Paul served on the Global UNDP Civil Society Advisory Committee and the steering committee of the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building. He's also had over 20 years of senior and top level strategic dialogue, engagement and advocacy on rebuilding the social contract and state-society relations with politicians, governments, the UN and other intergovernmental bodies, as well as business and development actors in 27 countries across Africa. Paul studied at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So just a few words on the format, how I will facilitate this session. We will start this afternoon's debate with short opening words by each panelist. And Domenico and Paul, I will prompt you in the chat when you have 1 minute to go, and then I will interrupt you quite promptly when your time is over. Apologies in advance if I interrupt you and disturb your stream of thought. We will ensure in this way that we can have a more interactive discussion. So there will be a round of questions to kick off a conversation between the two panelists that I will put to them. And I hope that there will also be time for questions from the audience that way. So please keep your questions or remarks to the point, and ideally indicate who they are addressed to. So Domenico, over to you.
Yeah, I didn't understand really. Is 1 minute or 3 minutes that we have?
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, so
you have 3 minutes. I would give you a prize if you could keep them within
to.
1 minute. Go ahead.
Okay, I will keep an eye on the watch. So thank you very much for the invitation. I think that it's very important to have this discussion now, in particular on the economic side of the partnership between the European Union and Africa. You know that since the summit in '97, the latest African Union European Union summit, there was a strong and consistent request from the African states, but not only from the African states, also from stakeholders such as youth, civil society, private sector, for I would say changing a little bit the paradigm of our cooperation with Africa, and to move into something that they would consider more strategic and more fit for purpose in terms of development. And these are, I would say, what I could summarize in 3 points, that are investments in productive investment, creation of decent jobs, and technology transfer. That was also one of the elements that was mentioned in the previous panel. I think that this is the request that was coming from the Africa. Everybody together, states, civil society, youth, and so on. And I think that this is perfectly in line with what we consider can be the threat that the Africa and the Europe should face for the future. That Africa will have to go 3, I would say, in parallel revolution. The first one is the industrial revolution, but it's an industrial revolution that must be at the same time green, digital, and then social, if I may say. So there are 4 revolutions that must be undertaken in order to move forward. This was before COVID. After COVID, I must say that these fundamentals remain even more valid, because I think that you clearly said that there was a going back after the COVID crisis, and therefore the only way is not that we can just put money in development cooperation, because we perfectly know that the money that we put in development cooperation, at least in the traditional way, is not sufficient in order to trigger what we can be a transformative dynamic in the continent. We remain, by the way, the first partner in terms of investment, in terms of migration flows, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of development cooperation. Nevertheless, I think that Europe has a problem in how to convey the message and how to convey a model that we can consider a model that is a winning one, considering that Europe is one of the most peaceful and developed area of the world over the last 50 years. So I think that these are the main elements, and in particular, when we move to youth and women, we consider what is important. It's clear that education, basic education, remain important. It's important to, for instance, to end with the literacy poverty, for instance. That is a little bit a new concept that I think is very important in terms of education. But what is important is also to provide to youth and women with the skills that are fit for market. Because if we are going to invest there, if we are going to promote, I would say, private sector, then the private sector must find the skilled workforce in order to fit with their development program. Last, and I think that this is a point, I think that what we are missing in Africa is a real stakeholder engagement. We started to have it with the private sector development, with private sector, with the business forum, but I think that where we are missing, and this is not just our responsibility, it's also an African responsibility of, I would say, leadership in Africa and in the African Union, is the area of stakeholders engagement in the policy agenda setting, I would say, more than in the implementation and so on, in how to define together where we could head to. And I hope that with the new protocol that we negotiated under post-Cotonou agreement, where we have a specific article related to the stakeholders engagement, we could, I would say, to overcome with this, that could be considered one of the big shortfall of the previous partnership with Africa. I will stop here, and I was just a little bit beyond my 3 minutes.
Well, you were perfect. Thanks very much, Domenico, for those opening words. I think there are a lot of issues that you've raised in that very short time that we will surely come back to. But without further ado, I pass on the floor to Paul. Go ahead, Paul. Paul, we cannot hear or see you. Can you put
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, I am sorry you cannot see me. Part of it is because I know that so many people are going to throw stones at me after this presentation. And I wanted to make sure that my face is not visible so that the stones cannot reach me. The other one is a technical issue that I'll try to deal with. But thank you so much, Domenico, and thank you so much for all the presentations that have been in the morning. They've been extremely, extremely rich, and I feel very sad that Portugal is having just one month left. And the reason why I say I'm feeling sad is because what I'm going to talk about began by the Portuguese. They were the ones who first came to the continent, and then they brought in the rest of Europe. And when the rest of Europe came, they refused to leave. So we are going back full circle. I am just briefly in the next 2 minutes, just going to talk about, I know that today's morning, there was a lot of discussion about fairness and about partnerships, and listening to Moses, listening to Tanya. I decided that rather than focus on that, I'm going to focus on something very, very different, and that is on friendship, not even partnership. And the reason why I'm talking about friendship rather than partnership is I decided to go over my inbox over the last 10 to 12 years. And I came across 14 different attempts by the EU and Europe to somehow develop some kind of partnership with the continent of Africa. And in every single occasion, they have been calling it fair, they have been calling it inclusive, they have been calling it partnership. But in every single occasion, Africa has always ended up not just being the loser, but the EU has ended up being very tough. The EU has ended up negating every single agreement that they make. In fact, I remember in 2015, I tried having dialogue with the EU over the FFD together with the SDG agenda, and I did not go very far. And so, having looked at all these 12. The honest truth is that the EU is not interested in a partnership with the African continent. Whether you call it fair, whether you call it inclusive, but I think the umbilical cord of the EU is so intertwined to the continent that other than extraction, they have come up with so many things, but there is absolutely no intention to implement them. And I'll show you why. I have shown you all those partnerships. And each of those have got the language of fairness, the language of inclusive, the language of all that. But the reality is that only 2 EU member countries have got any specific rules that make it easy for Africa to trade without losing to the multinationals in Europe. And if you look if you look at this is from TI, and I'm talking about data that is only 2 years old. These are things that we have been talking about for the last 30 years. And when you look at where we are right right now, I'm asking myself, is there really good faith on the part of the EU, or is the EU interested in making a PR game, but honestly, they're not interested in having a proper partnership? I'll give you a case in point. For a very long time, the EU attempted to have economic partnership agreements with the continent of Africa. What was interesting is it began as one economic partnership, but as more African countries realized that what the EU wanted was to dump Africa with the European goods, the EU started breaking EPA into small little bits. So there was an EPA for Southern Africa, there was an EPA for East Africa, there was an EPA for West Africa, and on paper they looked like they were one. But when you read them, you actually discover that they were completely different agreements based on the interest that the EU wanted from each of those blocks. Eventually it failed. What did the EU do? Wow, they quickly came around a new partnership on the continent called the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Now, everybody is telling you what is on the left. If you look at the left, this is something that is going to revive Africa. It is going to connect Africa. It is going to give Africa all the goodies that they have never received. The honest truth is, as we speak right now, the EU has put $80 million into the secretariat of the AFCTA, and every single policy being discussed there is in fact a reincarnation and a resurrection of the economic partnership agreements that the African governments had refused to sign. So what we are calling a free trade agreement is typically just the EU coming again through the back door to bring in what they couldn't get. What does that mean for the EU? The honest truth is we can talk about fairness, talk about truthfulness, talk about inclusivity. But what we have noticed over the last 2 years in the Middle East and in Africa is that what the EU is experiencing is a creation of its own policies. And I don't know how desperately I can tell the EU, this is not sustainable. We cannot continue creating a mess around the world, specifically on the continent, and then we come around, throw a little aid at some countries on the African continent, give a little aid to the Middle East, and then when the citizens, out of frustration, get into Europe, we now try to put borders and try to say that we do not want them. The honest truth is, unless we deal with the kind of policies and the kind of agreements we have, we'll continue to have these boats and we'll continue to have this kind of exodus. What does it mean? I just want to offer 5 very, very simple things. And sometimes it's a bit frustrating for me because unfortunately, these 5 things are not new. I have offered them and we have offered them as the African continent for the last 15 years. And every time we offer them, there is a clap. You are invited to the next conference and the EU tells you how they're looking at them. And they'll tell you, we like to have partnerships with the African continent. But the minute you close the door and you're out, it is back to the exploitation of the continent and whatever that. So allow me not to focus on the 5 because I think that you are all able to read them. But let me focus on the 4th one. There's a lot of conversations about China. But for me, China is only perfecting.
Sorry to interrupt you, Paul.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. We are closing in on your time allocated. So
and I've got in less than a minute.
Say your last few words, and we'll move into a conversation which will surely cover these issues.
Excellent. So the reason why I'm talking about the 4th one is that I think that rather than focus on what China is doing on the African continent, we need an introspection and ask what is it that we have done wrong on the African continent that China is merely perfecting. And for me, I think I will end with the words of the Kenyan ambassador who was speaking yesterday at a meeting. Africa's industrialization and development is of more value to the world than the short-term extractive thinking about its raw materials and minerals. Our colleagues feel as if our progress is their loss, that our rise will be at the expense of their gain. Africa rise is not your loss. And I really pray that we will remember that the loss of Africa is not the rise of Africa is not the loss of the EU. And I'm going to stop it there. Thank you.
Excellent, Paul. As I always knew, you're always speaking truth to power, but obviously there are a number of issues that you've raised that we could spend a whole day debating about. But let's continue with the conversation, and I invite questions in the Q&A section of the platform. But in the meantime, I suppose continuing on the theme of partnerships, because both you, Domenico, and Paul brought that up. And unfortunately, we were supposed to have somebody from UNECA join us, and we don't. But I'd like to flag a recent report that UNECA put forward, talking about a particular part of our partnership. And from Paul's last slide, where it started on trade and fiscal partnership, it started with that one. So let's talk about trade. The UNECA report pointed to the imbalanced trading relationship between Africa and the EU. Now, I'd ask both of you, what would be the conditions to have a more balanced relationship, trade-wise, but also, I mean, if you want to touch on the fiscal aspect, do so. And how can we ensure that this relationship does not contribute to further increase inequality? I'd start with you, Paul, because you were so spirited in your plea for a new kind of friendship and partnership. Go ahead. You have 3 minutes, Paul. I will ask you to keep your comment short. Thanks.
I will try to answer it in one sentence. Africa has got the highest levels of raw materials. As we speak right now, the UK is the largest exporter of tea to the European Union. The UK does not produce a single bit of tea. My father is part of the team that used to provide tea to the UK multinationals for a very, very long time. And I think what we need to ask ourselves is, if we only allowed the continent to trade in ways that move away from only allowing trade in raw materials, I can tell you Africa would go extremely far. It has been extremely difficult for Africa to develop any form of industries for their own because of the rules that have been put by the EU. Africa would like to process almost every single raw material that it produces. But the EU keeps on creating very complicated laws, very complicated policies that make it almost impossible for Africa to convert any of these raw materials. So we can talk about the fiscal policies, and I think that is a different conversation. But let's just talk about the very, very simple one, and that is it possible for you to create policies that will make it easier for us to trade in processed goods in much the same way you are also trading in processed goods that are actually being made out of our own raw materials? For me, I think that would be a very good step.
Very much, Paul. And Domenico, over to you, because obviously you also mentioned industrialization as a key priority. So I'm sure that there's a lot of like-mindedness, but what are your thoughts about the balancing of this relationship?
Well, I will not enter into debate, because you said that there was material for a full day discussion in what Paul just said. So I think that, of course, there is a reality that is the lack of industrial diversification that exists in Africa for different reasons. First of all, because they are producing the same crops, that are exploiting the same raw materials, but also because if you have to consider that the intra-Africa trade is at the lower or lowest level compared to the trade that Africa could have with other partners, both Europe, United States, or China. So I think that what is important is, first of all, is that they should go for industrial diversification, and I think that the idea of boosting investment is going in this direction of, I would say, creating the possibility for, I would say, a local production. The second is, and I fully agree with him, and I think that we tried to create a local added value. Let's take, for instance, the question of the the flag, the forest law and governance enforcement and trade, where there was this attempt not to export, I would say, timber and logs, but at least already a product with a local added value. And last is the development of Africa value chain through by identifying where Africa could have a competitive advantage in specific production and in specific value chain that, of course, will put together all the elements that make a product, I would say, sellable on the international scene. This question of the standards and so on, well, I can understand and I can agree, but they are the same that we have inside Europe in order to protect our consumer, in order to protect our our people, and they are applied to the United States, to China, and to anybody else that is exporting to Europe. So I think that, but at the same time, I think that we did an effort in order to try to develop, for instance, in the sanitary and phytosanitary criteria to help. And this was one of the elements that have been discussed, for instance, when we have been discussing the Africa Protocol on how to help African countries to reach the international standard, not even the European standard that in some cases, I agree, they are much higher than the normal international standard, but at least to help African country in reaching this I would say, this criteria that are the one that allow to be inserted into international trade. Just one reference: the Africa Continental Free Trade Areas is not an European project; it's an African project in order to create a continental free trade areas among African states. So we have nothing to do. It's nothing to do with the possible relation between a continent-to-continent free trade agreement. So just to be precise on specific points. Over to you, Jean.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Domenico, for that. I think we have talked a lot about the issue of the industrialization and trade relations intra-Africa and Africa-EU. But I think we would be amiss in this discussion if we not talk about inequality, particularly at this time. You might have heard the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva's warning just at the end of last week of the uneven recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And I think there have been a number of reports, including from the African Development Bank, warning particularly of the recovery in Africa. One of the key challenges before us, and certainly with regard to the EU-Africa partnership, is addressing this inequality. I'd start again with you, Paul. Do you perceive the increasing geopolitical shift in development policies, especially in EU policies, having a positive impact in this regard? Obviously, you might have heard about the objectives of our international partnership being aligned to EU foreign policy, and I'm sure you're not new to this discussion. We also have a question coming from the audience about the issue of the partnership, the responsibility, particularly of African countries in this regard. So I'd like you to comment both with regard to the EU responsibilities as well as the African responsibilities in this partnership, but also specifically addressing inequality, starting with you, Paul, and then over to you, Domenico.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, let me begin by admitting that at a very personal level, I am one of the individuals that is extremely frustrated with the actions of our own African governments. And I spend a lot of considerable time with them, trying to plead with them not to always sell Africa short. We don't need to keep on dumping our money into tax havens. We don't have to keep on exploiting our own citizens. So I am very fully aware and very fully alert to the shortcomings of the African continent. My problem is the EU is the one that is fueling that. I mean, if only the EU had made rules that make it difficult for their companies to get tax out of Africa, a lot of our despots would have nowhere to take their own money. If the EU dealt with the tax havens, a lot of our own despots would have nowhere. If the EU never sold arms in exchange for raw materials, a lot of what we have would not have happened. So I admit that we do have a challenge. But when I come to a forum like this, I am not coming to speak to our African governments. I am coming to plead with people like Domenico, who has made very good points. But the challenge is that by talking about having equal standards, it is asking a bird and an elephant to have the same equal competition on flying. And honestly, that is not fair for the African continent. Is there something in the geopolitics that is going to change during this period of COVID that the EU or the EU shift? If you look at if we look at what has happened over the vaccine nationalism, particularly within the EU, then you can see that honestly Africa is on its own. And I doubt whether any change is going to come out of the EU itself. For me, I think the change is actually coming from elsewhere. It's coming out of China playing the same game, and the EU discovering that unless it now changes its own tools, it is actually going to lose on the African continent. So for me, the geopolitics are in fact not even about the EU thinking that it needs to change, but the EU discovering that it desperately needs to get hold of the African continent, but it is losing the African continent to China, and there is very little that they can do about it because China is playing the same game that they have played for 60 years, only that China is now doing it on a much larger scale. And for me, that is the game changer for the African continent. Unfortunately, the African continent may lose in the short run, but sometimes I sit back in my home in Kenya and ask, between exploitation by the EU and exploitation by the China, which one is much better? Unfortunately, China has left much more on the African continent than countries such as France and such as the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also speaking to the question from the audience, there is a remark in the chat that I will call your attention to. I won't read it, but do have a look at that. Domenico, over to you.
No, there are points on which I agree on. I think that on the last point that Paul made, I don't agree at all. But this is another point. So to come back to your question about the fact that there could be an uneven recovery for the future, it's clear that the recovery will not be easy. You know that we are at the end of a specific financial framework, and we are establishing a new one at the moment, where we are discussing with the African counterpart, but also with other stakeholders about the priority. And you know, and this is what in support of what I said before on the fact that we have to develop an industrial sector inside Africa that is able to compete at international level and that is able to leverage sufficient capitals in order to develop. And I think that in this case, what we are doing through the system of the guarantees, where we are trying to ease the market condition for guarantees on investment in country where the normal market wouldn't go because the risk is too high. I think that this is a high contribution in trying to make this recovery less uneven. You also know that we as the Europe, with reticence by the great friend of Africa, that is China, we managed to get a moratoria on the debt repayment. And this was a purely EU initiative, not even supported at the beginning by United States. So I think that sometimes criticize the Europe is a very easy job in a sense. Last on the dimension, I think that we are working on the question of on how to manage on the illicit financial flow in order not to be sure that the money remain where the wealth is produced and not exported by is a problem that we still have also with our multinational among our countries. When we talk about Amazon that has a headquarters in Ireland, and so I think that this is we need, I think, a better governance, financial governance at international level, and this is something that we are struggling. Then, of course, we are accused of, I would say, blacklisting, of, I would say, creating the anti-money laundering blacklist, to creating the tax even blacklist, and so on. And I'm not defending, I would say, this unilateral way, but in a way is we have to make the case if we want to progress, I must say. And I think that our effort, at least in the what I could see in the programming exercise that is ongoing now, we are trying to make this recovery less uneven. And I think that also all the refurbishing of the existing money under the Team Europe initiatives and so on under the COVID-19 was aimed at trying to relaunch the national economies and in some cases also to support the functioning of the state. On the vaccine, you know that Europe, where I would say, first of all, we are not producing vaccine because all the vaccines are produced by American multinationals. But of course, with the contract and so on, we managed, first of all, to be sure that a vaccine could be available and could be available at a reasonable price. And then we supported the initiative at international and multinational level of the COVAX and the ATA mechanism on a more equal distribution of the vaccine. Hopefully by autumn there will be an excess of vaccine, and hopefully we will manage that everybody, but it's not that in Europe situation till 2 months ago was much better than in any other country in Africa in terms of vaccination or the COVID pandemic countermeasures. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you say we need a better financial governance at an international level. Absolutely, I'm glad to take that conversation to another time, because that is a big conversation to be had with the EU. But let's get back to the point that you raised about the recovery and the focus of the private sector. Obviously, one thing that this pandemic has made clear is how essential public services and the need for strengthening health education and water and sanitation is, and how the privatization of these services are obstacles to equal access for all. Now, obviously, you mentioned how important it is to build the private sector, and certainly they are part of the building blocks, I would say. But given the fact that, for instance, in the NDP or in the new multi-annual indicative program for Africa, the private sector pretty much is a red line. How would you ensure, or how does the EU ensure that its priorities and programs are not advertently or inadvertently increasing inequality in Africa by a kind of almost unilateral focus? Is there no blind spot in this unilateral focus on the private sector?
Well, considering your last question, no, I don't think that there is a blind spot. I think that we did some, I would say, trial and error activities during the former multi-annual financial framework in order to see how this process could be implemented. And I think that we are trying to improve, to take into account the fact that this should serve the priorities that are the local priority, and not, I would say, just the interest of the IFEs or the priority of the IFEs. So I think that this is something that is in the making and could be fruitful, because the idea is essentially to make market condition appealing where the market conditions are not to the normal market functioning, and therefore where there could be a potential market failure in terms of use of financial resources. So I think that this is my opinion at this point. Then I think that sometimes we have also I have the impression that we talk of Africa as Africa was one country. Africa are 55 different countries, 48 sub-Saharan, but even in the 48 sub-Saharan countries, we have a huge difference of development and the level of I would say, yes, development and economic integration. So this is this is what I can say. I saw some point in the chat where the ownership. I think that if you take the investment in London, they are, I would say, 80% owned by Chinese and Indians, if you want. So I don't think this question so much of the question of the ownership of the investment, but where the investment is going to pay the tax, and where the investment is producing wealth and is giving work to the people where the investment is established. Over to you, Eugene.
Thanks very much. It's been a very, very fascinating debate. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I do want to give Paul one last opportunity to respond or to say a few kind of departing thoughts before we close the panel.
I think in the same way that we have said that Africa is not a country, is the same way we cannot say that Europe is a country. There are very exceptional European countries that are doing very well. I've got very good relations with the African continent. I know of a lot of European governments that are frustrated with the EU itself and the EU policies, and they would really want to see Africa develop, and they're very genuine about it. However, I don't know whether the collective will of the EU is genuine, and I wish that I would agree with Domenico. I would love to agree with him every single day, but we work in 27 countries on the African continent, and the pain that I'm talking about is the pain we see every single day in every single country I go, and sometimes I would love to make it an academic dialogue, and I would like to make it a political dialogue, but for 1.2 billion people who continue to suffer every day at the expense of Europe, unfortunately, you can throw as many stones as you want at me, but to be quite honest, challenging the EU comes with a lot of personal costs. For me personally, it has come at a very high cost, but I think it is worth the fight. And I'm hoping that 50 years down the line, somebody will go online and go to this conversation and somehow say, in 2021, Paul was right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those last words. Domenico, you have 1 minute exactly. I know that the next panel is waiting to start. You have a last thought.
Okay, no, thank you. I think that in a way or another, we were prisoner of our past, at least of some of our countries that were former colonial powers. Problem is that, well, colony is over since more than 60 years. I'm not very young, but I wasn't even born when the colonization was over. So I think that there are at least 2, even 3 generations between the colonization and now. So I think that we should also go beyond this paradigm, and I think that the European Union is trying to move and to go beyond this paradigm that was the old one, the donor, the beneficiary, the do ut des, and so on, into something that is much more mature, that of course will require much more, I would say, also responsibility from the counterpart, that they cannot just throw the responsibility out of its border to somebody else. So I think this is something that is very important, and I think that we are managing to work in this sense. Of course, is right. We have 27. The role of the European Union is to try to get a common action, a common position when we move into the external relation. But this is the weakness that we have, because when you compare European Union to China, is not something that is comparable, because on one side you have one state with a state apparatus to move and to promote the national economic development and projection. On our side, we have, I would say, an entity that is trying to get a kind of minimum common denominator. So I think that we have also to
Sure.
consider this kind of.
Domenico,
sure.
Yeah, obviously another very, very big discussion to be had on the geopolitics of the relationship and the partnership with Africa. I'll leave that to another day and to another debate. For now, I will say thank you very much to you, Domenico, and to you, Paul, for this really interesting conversation. A lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we will hear from each other again. And I sincerely hope Paul's wish that one day we will be talking about a genuinely sustainable partnership between Africa and EU will come true. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sven.
Thank you, Jean, Domenico, and Code. Sorry, not Code, Paul. Sorry. Code is our next, David Code is our next moderator for our last panel conversation we're having today. And they will be speaking about human rights at the core of a democratic partnership. David, I pass the floor to you for our last panel discussion. David, are you around? I can see you in my screen now. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Sven. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm joining the call from Johannesburg. It's a pleasure connecting with you on this very critical topic and issue that's happening at a very critical time. I'll be moderating this panel as Sven said. I'm just looking to find out if the other panelists have joined the call. So we have Marisa Matthias, we have Simao Tila from Mozambique, and then we have Ambassador Salah Hamad. It will be good for them to switch on their cameras. I can see Ambassador so that we can begin. Okay, thank you so much. This conversation is happening at a very critical period. There is so much to talk about when you refer to the relations between the European Union and Africa. And I think last week, what dominated some of these conversations on the continent is when African leaders went to France, or a handful of African leaders went to France to have a conversation on Africa. And so many around in civil society and political and academic cycles were questioning why a conversation on Africa should not happen on the continent. There's history there, there's geopolitics, and it will be good for us to navigate through these issues at a very crucial period. So we have three experienced, exciting, and fascinating colleagues who will join me on the panel. I'll begin with a brief introduction, and then I'll pose some questions to each of the panelists. The first colleague I'd like to introduce is Marisa Matthias. who has been a member of the European Parliament since 2009, and she co-chairs the Left Political Group. She's a member of the Nation of the Industry, Research and Energy Committee, and a member of the AFET and DRO Committee as well. She's Vice President of the European Left Party, and it's a role that she has held between 2010 and 2016. Next on the panel is Simao Tila, who is actually from the civil society sector, has about 29 years of experience working with civil society. He's currently the executive director of the NGO, the Joint League of NGOs in Mozambique. And he's a founding member of Africans Rising, a member of the Affinity Group of National Associations. And, you know, he also belongs to several other civil society groups around the continent. Last person to introduce is Ambassador Salah Hamad, who is the head of the African Governance Architecture Secretariat. And sorry, let me just sort this out. This disruptions. I'm sorry about that interruption. Ambassador Salah Hamad is the head of the Human Rights and Transitional Justice Unit within the Department of Political Affairs and Peace and Security of the African Union Commission. So we have an exciting panel who have a lot of experience on these issues. And so without further ado, I'd like to call on Marisa. Marisa, you were one of the few members of the European Parliament who voted against a recent report on EU-Africa relations. And your argument was that it is not acceptable to frame the strategy, the new strategy on the EU's intention to have a leadership role on the continent. I guess we're coming from a point that if there's to be partnership, it has to be a partnership of equals. Could you please tell us how the EU can distinguish its role from other key players on the continent, particularly those who come into the partnership based on a relationship that's supposed to be, they are leaders and Africans have to follow. Could you please tell us how the EU can set an example and distinguish its role from other key players? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for this important and interesting conference. Yes, okay, it's I don't know how to summarize the reasons, but okay, the discussion about European Union Africa strategy was quite interesting, and honestly, I think that at the end, this strategy has some dimensions which are much better defined than in previous agreements and partnerships. And for instance, I do think, and coming back to the previous panel, I do think that when it comes to green and the energy transition, we are in a better position now, although I'm not fully I don't fully agree with the proposal, but we are in better position now than we were before, especially because there are already some measures introduced concerning the exploitation of resources and things like that from, I don't know, all sorts of multinationals and other problems which we had before and were not identified. And also, I think there are good grounds for cooperation when it comes to digital transition and also sustainable growth. The problem is, again, that the way the partnership is framed in some of the areas, and basically I would say the key narrative is still about, as you were saying, that you were quoting me, and very correctly, is still based on a relation of leadership. And so it's like, for instance, in some of the domains and some of the articles of the strategy is defined like the European Union has to do this, this, and this in order not to lose, for instance, for China or other countries or regions in the world when it comes to Africa. And so that's for me a huge problem, because the leadership in the African countries should be, of course, an African leadership from the different countries and not a dispute from other regions of the world. And even that there are really interesting dimensions in this new partnership, there are also very problematic ones. And this one is, what I'm saying is still not a partnership amongst equals. There are still some power relations there, more or less explicit. There are still some kind of signs from the past, if you can say like this. And I think the areas where it is basically more evident have to do with the parts related to security and the parts related to growth, and also the parts related to migration and mobility. It's not real cooperations. There is still a kind of modeling this partnership, as I said, in a different relation of power and different power balance. So that's why I voted against, because even there are positive dimensions, I cannot accept that in 2021 we still talk about disputing leadership in Africa, in African countries. So I think we need to do better than that. Of course, as you can imagine, this was a very interesting debate, because on the other side of the parliament composition, we also had the far right trying to avoid any kind of cooperation when it comes to migration and mobility, saying that this partnership could be a threat to the European Union welfare states. So it was quite interesting, but I'm afraid that we still need to do a lot of work to see a real partnership amongst equals, as I was saying. And I think that the example that we have now concerning COVID-19 and the patents issue and the TRIPS agreement is a good example how this cooperation amongst equals is not taking place yet at all, because European Union is more and more isolated when it comes to the TRIPS waiver and the capacity of the possibility of transferring technological capacity to other countries and the regions of the world, knowing that the only way that we have to fight a global pandemic is to not to put property and profit in front of protecting lives and public health, and still we are not there yet. We are not there. And if it's not a pandemic giving us the reasons to be there, I don't know what it is. So I think we still have a lot of work in order to follow this power relation, and because there are dimensions that should be discussed and are not discussed. For instance, and I will finish with this because I'm talking for long, but for instance, the issues linked to external debt, the things linked to the resources and especially the natural resources and exploitation and things like that. And there's no much critical sense there in terms of seeing that we cannot continue like this. So that's why I voted against. And I'm sorry, because I was answering for all this time, and I don't know if it was properly your question, because my connection was not so good, so I didn't listen very well. But in any case, I can come back to whatever you asked if it was not the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisa. I think you answered like somebody who got the entire question without any interruptions. But before we go to Ambassador, I want to pose a follow-up question. So we've often, particularly civil society groups in Africa, have often looked up to the EU and other European states when there are civic space restrictions on the continent. But over the last couple of years, we've seen some of the established democracies in the EU, promulgating some draconian legislation that would restrict civic space, not just in their countries, but it seems to be a pattern that may be taken up by several EU states. You know, in the UK, for example, quite restrictive legislations. I know the relationship now that the UK is breaking away. Restrictive legislation that would target freedom of peaceful assembly. In France, there are protests and concerns about other draconian legislation. We've seen what's happening in Hungary over the last couple of years. Are you concerned about this reversal of democratic gains and this sliding into, some kind of restrictions that are being implemented by the same governments who used to speak out when other countries across the world, particularly those in Africa, implemented such laws that are restrictive? Marisa, I don't know if you got that.
Yes, in fact, I didn't connect my video, so in order to listen better, because try to use the resources. Yes, I'm quite worried with the developments across Europe when it comes to freedom of gathering, and also a lot of important democratic principles and rule of law in the different states. Hungary is a clear example, Poland also, but also if we look to Malta and we see what happened just recently when Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist, started to denounce corruption in the government and she was murdered, and we still don't have full justice and several years have passed already. We had the same problem with the Slovakian journalist Jan Kuciak, and recently in France, as you said, limitations to gatherings and to demonstrations, and we had just very, very recently the prohibition of the demonstrations supporting Palestinian people and the Palestinian territories in France, while when we had recently the attacks, the most recent attacks from Israel in Gaza, with the justification that it can be seen as anti-Semitism. So we are entering, I think, in a period which is really dangerous to normalize and kind of naturalize practices which are just the opposites to the democratic culture. In any case, we still have a lot of work defending human rights and fighting for human rights, and a lot of active dialogues with governments and especially with NGOs around the world. And so I do think that, for instance, in the European Parliament, the Human Rights Committee is still a very good and ground basis to establish dialogue with several partners around the world and to pay attention to the problems that for instance, human rights defenders are facing across the world. But we cannot ignore that we are witnessing several and very worrying step backs when it comes to human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press in Europe. And that's something really that we need to take into account, especially because the way the European Union still presents itself is like, and I'm not saying that we are not protecting it in some way, but we are not anymore, I would say, if we were ever in any moment, but we are not anymore for sure, the place where we have a kind of moral stance when it comes to human rights. I think that we have to identify in a very humble way that we always have problems, that there were always problems linked to, for instance, linked to racism, to xenophobia, to LGBTQI rights, women's rights. And now, on top of that, we are facing also threats from the far right, becoming more and more institutionalized and more acceptable across Europe. So I think that that calls for not to turn our backs, but to reinforce the cooperation and the networks across the world, and not giving up fighting the human rights, and of course trying to do it within the European Union, in the sense that I think we need to find ways to not let far right still grow, and especially not to enter into a political environment where these things seem to be normal and natural, and they are not, neither normal nor natural. And of course, this is something of huge concern, for sure.
Thank you so much. Well said. Thank you so much, Marisa. Ambassador Hamad, I would like to come to you now. Since 2006, we've been having the AU-EU Human Rights Dialogue. That seems to be progressing well. How can this kind of engagement between the AU and the EU be strengthened?
Thank you so much, Mr. David, and allow me to just take a moment to thank the organizers for inviting the African Union, particularly the African Governance and Peace and Security Architecture Secretariat, to be part of this wonderful discussion. I have been observing some of the sessions that took place earlier today, and I'm quite impressed with the level of maturity that really labeled the discussions that are taking place on this very important topic on the partnership between Africa and Europe. Before I answer the question, allow me to just take a quick, let me a few seconds to just speak about really the need for strengthening the partnership as a whole between Africa and Europe. Simply, a partnership could be between Africa and a country in Europe, Africa and or African country and another country, but this partnership between Africa and Europe is very strategic. Strategic by all means, and simply because we are not just neighbors, but because also of the history we share, the traditions we share, the cultures we share, the blood we share, that so many Africans are living in Europe and so many Europeans are living in Africa, and are not just living, but in fact, they are part of the rainbow color that we have in Africa and Europe. So these two, what really bring us together is not just politics and benefits and interest, but also this diversity that make us united and make us stronger in this partnership. So really, I believe, as one of those who have been coordinating this partnership from the AU side from the beginning of it, I really feel like there's really need to put more emphasis on enhancing this partnership and make it more stronger. The AU-EU Human Rights Dialogue has been in place since 2016, as you mentioned, and we've been meeting on regular basis. Last year we had the 15th dialogue, and the dialogue has reached a very mature level where we are really discussing very sensitive and very important issues for both continents, Africa and Europe. And in fact, the dialogue has been more stronger and more richer by allowing the civil society to hold an Africa-Europe civil society dialogue on the margin of this dialogue for the last 4 years or so. With that, we also ensure the participation not only of civil society, but civil society, think tanks, academia, and media on this important dialogue. And the dialogue is not only about, in fact, reaching agreements and issuing communiques and declarations, but usually the dialogue results in an action plan that is implemented by the two organizations within a period of a year before the next dialogue is to take place. So as African Union Commission and as the person who is coordinating this dialogue from this side, I'm quite satisfied with the level of maturity that we have reached in our dialogue, and also the political support that we are getting from both leaders and from the African side and from the European side. And of course, there's a lot more to be done. But let me once again just conclude by saying that the dialogue is going well. The dialogue has reached a very important level of maturity. The dialogue involves civil society, media, and academia. But again, there's really more to be done to make it more open and more sincere, I would say. But hopefully, as we go, we will get to that level of that we are both hoping for from Africa and from Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. One major concern from civil society on the continent is these sorts of dialogues are happening at some kind of a supranational level, and the outcomes of the dialogue or the feedback from the dialogue does not translate to communities or those who are really working at grassroots level. In fact, there is a popular saying among civil society dialogues like these, you are likely to see the same kind of partners, those who have access to connections, those who have access to formal institutions like the AU, those who even have access in this age where most of these dialogues are happening virtually. Are there plans to ensure that the outcomes of the dialogue translate and get down to grassroots and communities so they can also benefit, even if they don't sit at the table or even if they don't participate formally?
Well, thank you so much, David, for this question. But let me just say that as two commissions, AU and EU, we don't really intervene much in the affairs of this civil society dialogue. There's a steering committee that is composed of 3 from each continent, from civil society, and the entire process is left for them, in fact, to select the participants and to select the topics and to freely have discussions and deliberations that will result in very clear recommendations that could be presented at the dialogue itself. So as two commissions, really, we have nothing much to do with this. But we have really tried our best to support the two sides from the members of the steering committee to make sure that those who are invited to this dialogue are not the elites among the civil society organizations, if I can put it that way. But in fact, we invite those who are really the grassroots organizations that are very linked and connected to the community. And we have seen, in fact, many of those who are participating in this dialogue. Some of them, they never in fact participated in this kind of dialogues before. And I was very impressed in the last dialogue we had when I met online, of course, one participant from Uganda, a lady who came from a small village who never heard of the African Union as a continental organization. I was not really shocked because I believed her that really she didn't hear about it, but I was really pleased that she finally came to engage herself and her organization in an affair of the African Union. So as we go, I hope things will be better and better, but we are there to support as two commissions, let me say, to support, of course, the steering committee that is in charge of the civil society dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you. Very, very interesting responses. I really appreciate. Marisa, I'd like to come back to you. How would you propose that the EU upholds human rights and promotes democratic principles on the continent? What can the EU do more than it's doing at the moment to uphold human rights and promote democratic principles on the continent of Africa?
I think that one important part has to do with, of course, keeping the dialogue and an inclusive dialogue, and having the capacity to integrate in this dialogue different actors and also and always, I think, civil society organizations and other representatives. That's an important part, because of course without dialogue is very difficult for us to have a proper intervention in the sense of building together a better future, peaceful and protective of human rights. But I think that there's an important part of the role that the European Union can do better, which has to do with a different or a more a deeper regulation of the activities of, for instance, European multinationals in the African countries. We have witnessed over the last years the fact that there are numerous ways of exploitation of resources which not only do not respect human rights as they contribute in some way to aggravate the situation of peoples in the different contexts, and also, for instance, to create ways of protection and security and defense within the states, specific measures of defense and organized protection within the states and sometimes against the state. To give a concrete example, we have been discussing a lot what is happening in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. And of course, we cannot ignore the role of the European multinationals there and the way they have created and funded forces of security, which at some point were acting against human rights and against the very own populations and local populations. Is not the core of the problem, but is also part of the problem. So we need to take that into account. And so we have been trying to work in the definition of a clear dimension of corporate social responsibility and human rights responsibility wherever there are situations like this. And I do think that we need to hold accountable all those who have economic activities in the African countries, and especially exploitation sites. And of course, the discussion has to go beyond that, but that would be already a good part if that accountability would be achieved, and also a lot of the practices would not be allowed in the current days.
Thanks, Marisa. That's a very important point you make. And just to follow up on that, do you raise some of these concerns in the EU Parliament? One big challenge, like you mentioned, on the continent is, multinational corporations and other huge companies that, exploit land, they exploit natural resources. And when communities speak out against such exploitation, it's basically a David and Goliath battle where communities are fighting big corporations who have the best lawyers, who have good partnerships with the states. Do you raise some of these concerns in the European Parliament? And what are some of the responses that you get if you raise them?
Yes, we do raise these in the European Parliament, as I said, especially in the Human Rights Committee, because we receive lots of claims and denounces of violations of human rights across the world, and so several of them come also from European countries, and a lot of them in the sense to make these enterprises, multinationals, more accountable, as I said. We also have started to create some measures and define measures and create proposals in order to try to criminalize inside Europe the illegal exploitation and appropriation in other countries. One important voice to in this field, in this area, was already, I don't know, around 10 years ago, or perhaps more, I don't remember well, but I think around 10 years ago, it was a clear demand from Dr. Denis Mukwege, who came to the parliament and specifically asked for us to take some action because of the excessive exploitation of land and resources, and jams and in Congo, Democratic Republic, and the way it was affecting not only the resources and the people's lives, but also how it was helping increasing crime and corruption and murdering and violations and especially a lot of human rights violations against women, and so that was one of the first cases that we dealt with. But yeah, we follow that. We can only produce recommendations, but we do that, and we still do that. And so our contribution in the discussion of the EU-Africa partnership also was very, very concentrated in these dimensions, which are quite important, because that's it. In some cases, you can promote the best practices, let us call like this, inside the European Union, but you cannot close the eyes to the abuses that European Union corporations, multinationals are in charge of several activities in other countries. We cannot close the eyes to their activities and the impacts, and especially when it comes to, as it's still the case, when it comes to very unequal appropriation of the land and of the resources of some countries.
Thank you so much. Again, well put. Ambassador, I'd like to come back to you based on the conversations that the African Union, particularly the human rights, the conversations on human rights that you have as the African Union with the EU. So in terms of this relationship, how does the African Union see the EU? Are they equals, or like those ordinary Africans, people on the ground who perceive this as a very unequal relationship and kind of cluster African leaders in the same way as European Union leaders. How does the African Union see the EU and this partnership?
Thank you so much, David. I think this is really a question that could be looked at as a sensitive matter, but let me try to answer it without really being too much of a politician. When the partnership began a few years ago, I must admit that the partnership was not really a true partnership of equals. It was looked at or seen from both sides, in fact, as a partnership of a donor that is supporting another partner who is in need. But over the years, I must admit, with sincere and deep and honest dialogue, things are really changing, not changed totally, but things are changing, things are improving. And I think also one of the reasons for changing that perception is the fact that Africa from the beginning was looked at as the backyard of Europe, simply because of the history of colonialism, the history of poverty and conflict in Africa, and because of also of so many things related to past to issues that happened in the past. So addressing those issues of the past were really important for us to have a new beginning. Europe, to some extent, or the European Union in particular, was also addressing Africa as the Mediterranean region, which is closer to the to Europe, as the neighbors that are, rightly what is in the back of Europe, and then of course Sub-Saharan African, and then South African or Southern African countries. One of the initial requests that we made to our colleagues and friends in the European Union is to really begin to address Africa as one continent, not as three regions. Because indeed Africa is one continent, and indeed if we want to have a successful partnership, we have to really enter into this partnership as two continents, not a continent and three regions in the other continent. So over the years, things have really improved. Things have changed. Why the change is not really felt at the level of the ordinary citizens of Africa? Excuse me. I would say the reason is because we don't really have a good communication strategy that is really reflecting on the positive impacts and results that have been achieved in this partnership. And we really need to maybe think of a strategy that will involve the ordinary citizens in both Europe and Africa. Those who are farmers in France, those who are cattle herders in the Netherlands, those who have nothing to do with politics, but also those who are also in Africa in the rural areas where there is no power, where there is no electricity, where there is no internet connection, where there is no radio, TV. How can this partnership reach to all of those who are really far away from any communication means or ways? These are issues that we need to address. And I think to make it a more successful partnership, the partnership itself must be transformed at some point to be a people-centered partnership. So then people from Africa and Europe will be able to also input into issues that are discussed between Africa and Europe for the benefit of both continents. With that, we will ensure people participation, people involvement. And when we are talking about people here, I mean, in particular, youth from both continents. In particular in Africa, or especially in Africa, because Africa is a young continent, and 65% of the population of Africa are youth. And most of those youth, they get wrong information about Europe, and then they try to leave behind everything they have to go for greener pasture in Europe. But unfortunately, before reaching Europe, they die in the Mediterranean Sea or in the desert, in the Sahara. So I think the African youth really need to be involved and engaged fully in this partnership in order for them to be able to have access to the right information before they take that decision of crossing the Mediterranean. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think you ended on a very high note by proposing a solution, a way forward, and you touched on the very important issue of the youth. Africa has the youngest population in the world, and we've had this conversation several times. So I'd just like to ask you and Marisa, because our time is up, if you have any last words before I hand over to Sivan.
Just a very short intervention, just to say that I do agree with what Ambassador just. I also agree that over the last years, I do not think in any case that we, because of being improved, that we can consider that we are already in a good position and in in a equals relationship. We are not, but I also think that is important to take into account that we are talking about European Union and Africa. We are talking about a subcontinent and a continent, because also in Europe the countries are quite different. There's huge diversity, there are several inequalities, but of course the European Union, when it presents itself to negotiations, it is presented like a bloc. So of course we in order to be, that's also an important part and dimension of promoting a partnership amongst equals, as it's to consider two blocks and not one block and then some of the parts from the other side. So I think this is really important issue to also take into account. And again, thank you for letting me enter into this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marisa. Really honored to have you on the panel, and thank you so much for expressing your honest views. Ambassador, any last words on?
Well, I think Honorable Marisa has said it all. And in my culture, when women speak, men need to really be quiet and listen. And if men are the heads, women are the neck, which moves the head left and right. So in fact, she said it all, but let me just add a few things that, if you don't mind, to conclude in a minute. One, I think this partnership deserve, as I mentioned earlier, deserve to be really given an attention. Africa as a young continent is the future, and Europe certainly is in need of this partnership as much as Africa is. So there's so many things that really bring us together, as equal as possible. Yes, Africa, the Africa we're speaking today about is about almost 50 years old after the end of colonialism. Europe is more mature. Also, the new one that we are talking about is only about 60 or 70 years after the Second World War. So I think both continents really need to cling to this, or to stick to this partnership, to grow up together and to really share the wealth, but also share the experience and share the human resources and share so many things that could be in fact shared between the two continents. I mentioned the issue of youth, and this is something that we could even speak about more and more. But again, the partnership needs to be a people-centered partnership. With that, we'll ensure that this partnership will grow, will flourish, and also will advance. If we keep it political and peace and security and related to peace and security issues only, then it will be a partnership of needs. That means I knock on your door once I need you, and once I don't need you, I don't need you. Let's make it a partnership of inclusiveness, a partnership that will really allow both Africa and Europe to benefit from it. And with that, we'll ensure this partnership will be as strategic as it could be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Once again, thanks to both of you for your very informative, presentations and pitches. And thank you so much to all participants for taking time to listen to us. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Steven. Thank you, Steven. Over to you.
Thank you, David, for navigating this last panel. And of course, thank you to the panelists for sharing their point of view. Wow, this was definitely a rich day with lots of input, lots to think about, lots to reflect on further, and many discussions that are open and that definitely need to be continued. Before I let you go home to a weekend, I would like to ask you to fill in a very small questionnaire so we can identify well how you experience this conference, and you see it normally in your screen right now. The poll that has appeared, it's only 2 simple questions where you just have to click. It is anonymous, so please take just a few seconds to fill in this questionnaire. And while you are doing that, I would like to tell you that you are very welcome to visit the platform's website and social media. You can follow the latest news about ongoing activities with the scope of the Portuguese presidency project, and of course, everything that is going on in the platform. And I'm almost saying sayonara, bye-bye to you. Before going, I would like to thank the moderators for their guidance and punctuality. We managed to keep the day within the time frame that we had planned, and that's always a success when we have so many speakers and so many contributions. So well done to all of you. Of course, a big thank you for the speakers and the panelists for lending their time and sharing with us their diverse and sharp views. I've heard some pretty good and strong statements throughout the day, and I really appreciate to hear that. Of course, we cannot forget all the participants for being here and having an interest in this very important topic, the organizers of the event for bringing us all together, and the technical staff who made this all possible. Also, thank you to the translators who made sure that this could be an event where people who speak different languages can take part and be able to speak their language and listen to the contributions in their own language, which makes it more interesting and also allows everybody to participate. With that being said, I wish you a wonderful and sunny, hopefully sunny weekend, and I'm looking forward to meet you again on another occasion. Have a great evening and see you around. Bye-bye.